Assuming the system works the way it's supposed to, we're in good shape. Introductory material. This. So I know it jumps around. I'm just lazy with where I put all the PowerPoints. It's okay. I'll get over it. And, but so on your blackboard, for instance, so here, let me get up there and show it to you. It happens to fall on week 3, this unit on the heart and blood vessels, which is really the next big issue in lab. I suspect our first lab thing is going to have nerves and heart at the least. And endocrine doesn't lend itself to laboratories stuff. It's more of a lecture component. So I think we're going to see nerves and heart and probably blood vessels be the first unit of any relevance for this, when it comes to a laboratory activity. So if you look at, this is week 3 of the blackboard. As you scroll down, you'll see the heart PowerPoints and the blood vessel PowerPoints. And interestingly, you will see this, the heart blood vessel outline, which was 2 separate outlines that I just put together for convenience, and here they are. So you can see this. I mean, this is yours to peruse. All the stuff I'll be telling you today, circulation from the coronaries. And so it sort of overlaps lecture, which is the physiological aspect, and lab, which is the anatomical aspect. Today we're going to deal with the anatomical, and next week we're going to take a look at the electrocardiography aspects of it, etc. And then we'll get to blood vessels. So this is just a lot here. Okay, B waves, T waves, QRS, a lot of the dynamics of the heart, they're all there. And so I apologize for not having changed the numbers. This book has had different numbers for different chapters that have varied every so often by 1. So you're going to see now 17 is the heart, 18 is blood vessels. So that should say chapter 18 outline, just you'll figure it out. You want to change it for your purposes, if indeed, that's fine. And then all this stuff, blood vessel stuff. So I have taken the liberty, as it were, to give you a lot of this material already pre-noted. You don't have to, there's no additional fee that they will allow me to collect. Not that I didn't want to collect. My wife says to stop doing that. And sooner or later, one of the students is going to complain that you're beyond crazy. My children, if you ever get a message from a naval site with someone named Stein, is my dad doing anything that I can possibly force him to get into the nursing home? He may try to do this. He's like, I'm fond of saying, don't have children. But he's a lovely kid. The grandkids are great. The wife's great. All right. So that's the introductory stuff. Let's get on with the heart. So this is and now the current aspect of the textbook. This will appear as chapter 17, the heart anatomy. So really, and 17A is the anatomy, 17B is the physiology. 17B, we do a section in lab where we look at the cardiography, and I typically will probably do that next week. Now, we're having a meet here tomorrow, not you guys, but myself and like Dr. Robbins and Mrs. Maurer, who runs all the labs, and some of the instructors like you would have had in AP1. We're trying to get a hold of, get numbers on these specimens. These are some of the things that are probably still usable. And so next time we dissect, it's going to take a little bit. Right? Because I really don't have anything here other than kidneys that really are, we're going to have to put in order. So we may not dissect anything for a week or 2. Probably 2 weeks, I would think, at least. Just because we do a fair amount of it. The heart's the next one on our list. So just wanted to give you a heads up that hopefully we're supposed to have that tomorrow after I have a lecture till from 1 to 2, and they're supposed to be in here about 2 o'clock. So I'll have more information next week. Okay. And that's the boilerplate. That's what's going on. The heart. It is the most interesting aspect of this is that it's so simple. I guess to think of something that is so that I say it, believe me, 1,000 times. It beats more rapidly than once a second every second of your life. Yet all it really is a pump that's two-sided. One pump sends it to your lungs for oxygen, the other pump sends it to your circulation. And it has two chambers, two sides, two chambers that pump identical volumes. The amount of blood is always equal, or has to be, going to your lungs that's coming back to your heart to be pumped out to your body. Because if it's not, it's imbalanced. And the minute the heart loses that balance, sooner or later, that heart will be doomed to what's called heart failure. Because that's really what failure is. It's the inability of one side to keep up with the other, and eventually both sides fail. That's the great tragedy of what untreated or undertreated heart failure would be. So effectively, you're going to see this interesting pump that has very tiny chambers to receive blood coming back from whatever, and comparatively large chambers, at least proportionately, that don't look equal but are equal, that gather that blood, or collect it would be a better word, and eventually fill themselves maximally to optimally. I've got a lot of allies in these sentences, optimally, maximally. I love language. To be able to accumulate that blood, and if I didn't do it, oh, you're somebody backing up. Optimally or functionally into the ventricles, which are the pumping chambers, and from there the blood is distributed wherever it's supposed to go. So, to summarize, all right, I give up. It's my neighborhood. They're putting in a new cable system, if you didn't know. Be complaining about it up in Cranberry. They're adding cable, fiber optic cable. They're digging up everything. The dog is beside himself. Can't deal with all these people there in his territory. You're in my territory. So the right side is what's the side where all of the blood that has been utilized in some way, shape, or form, picked up from the tissues, effectively is deoxygenated, it's not bereft of oxygen. Venous blood that has been utilized and has less oxygen, approximately a quarter less oxygen, and still 75% oxygen. So people are already under the misconception of that, and it's time to be done with that. And that blood then is collected on the right side and sent to the lungs by way of what's called the pulmonary circuit, where it's oxygenated in the lungs. It is a slow, relatively speaking, quiet journey. Okay, it's designed to reoxygenate relatively quickly. It is a low pressure system as it meanders its way through the lungs, and really just in a fraction of a second reoxygenates. Though it might take a bit more time like that to return its way to the left side of the heart, which is the end of that pulmonary circuit, where the left side of the heart is the beginning of what's called the systemic circuit, sending blood everywhere, including to the heart itself. Oxygenated blood to start the whole thing over again. So you basically have a series of chambers, and I'll draw them out up there. I have a little way I do it, whether it's of any consequence or not. Right atrium and left atrium. Okay, those are the receiving chambers that are on either side. Right receives it from systemic, left from pulmonary. The pumping chambers immediately below them. Let's leave it like that for now, till we begin to understand how the heart morphs in shape over time. And the receiving and they're the pumping chambers. This is where the business is done. The atria don't really have a lot to do with what goes on unless something goes wrong. Someone develops this very severe condition called atrial fibrillation. That's a big problem. So the atria are really, the blood's only temporarily in, more than anything else. So the ventricles are the pumping chambers, respectively, right pulmonary, left systemic. And you see this illustration 1,000 times. So effectively, blood's coming back this way by very large veins, and transiently, because this gateway, this valve is open to allow the blood to immediately feed in. And then when it's ready, it pumps it to the lungs. returns it to the left side. Same deal happening, except this time it pumps all over the body. Pretty simple. Heart smaller than you think, less than a pound, typically around, estimate would be the size of your fist if you put it here. It's located in that section that you learned about in between the lungs, the mid-sternal area, known as the mediastinum. Okay, so the mediastinum has the pericardial cavity and the sac where the heart is located, and then above it where we have the trachea and the big vessels, whereas the trachea terminates into the bronchi going into the lungs. They're just above that area. Okay, it sits on top of the diaphragm. Even though the heart starts centrally, the left side is more muscular. And what happens over time, so this is still, relatively speaking, bilateral and symmetrical. It's just that the left side is more developed. So what happens is something that starts centrally at conception, when we finally begin to see after X couple of weeks that there is something in there that's acting in a pumping fashion, is beginning to move a bit toward the left. It's going to predominate, and that's going to dictate a lot of its shape and eventually its position. So what we're looking at here in the adult heart, 2/3 is to the left of that mid-sternal line. It sits behind the sternum, anterior to the vertebral column. Its orientation is such that you'll begin to see sort of in many ways how it appears and where it points. So you're going to have effectively let's say a modified triangular shape with an apex which is really where the maximum force comes from the heart, down lower left, sort of pointing towards your left hip, and the base being this way, pointing up towards your right shoulder. Kind of the general orientation of the heart. That's why we look at this with regard, and you'll see if you ever had it, and I'll have a whole unit on cardiography, but if you ever have one of these done, that when they do what they call a 12-lead EKG, you place the leads according to these intercostal spaces and in certain areas where they're located. So there's the main leads that we call the limb leads, go 1, 2, 3, and 4. But there's 6 more that pick up certain specific locations. You'll see that it's in the EKG here. That we'll do next week. Heart there, and you can see it just occupies a ton of space, and the big muscular areas are the ventricles, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And these are openings that are trying to reflect the atria. Trust me, the atria are not that big. Base toward the right shoulder, apex left hip. The apical impulse is where folks who use a stethoscope to listen, what we call auscultate, are trained to put this, they palpate the interspace between the 5th and 6th ribs below the left nipple line. That's the point of maximum impulse. If you're going to listen, you want to listen there. And there's different things with stethoscopes. I don't know how much often you'd be called to use on them. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. I say this to all I don't have the ear for this. Having the ear to listen to heart murmurs and things. There's a gazillion places online you can listen that you'll be able to hear the sounds more definitively. I don't have it. My first wife had it. It was amazing. Oh, I can hear an S2 murmur. Really? Don't have it. Hey, I don't have any musical talent either. So everybody has a gift. Some people have that particular gift that's there. So that's the kind of one, if you're ever going to hear one, someone will hear it, say, here, take this, put it in your ear and listen. Do you hear this sound or that squeak or that? That's what it sounds like. That's how you learn. So it looks like this, but hey, wait a minute. This isn't my concept. What are these vessels? They're all coming out up at the top. So I'll show you kind of the way I mock it up in my world. Really? Really? Nevertheless, this to me is the way I would represent a heart, just for our purpose, box diagram. And effectively, what you're going to see, you have chambers, your standard notation. So as you're looking at this, right? So this is the right atrium, not drawing. Left atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle, left ventricle. So reality is the ventricles are massively larger in volume than the atrium. So we'll see that shortly. But if you imagine this as being midline, how do we get to that? And how come the aorta and the pulmonary trunk are exiting at the top? Learned it down here at the bottom where they started. Well, again, it has to do with this massive muscular development. So it's like somebody that works out, yeah. So they're working on girl and doing stuff like that all muscles are massive. What happens is the left is swollen. So kind of like imagine those vessels that exit at the bottom over time become like this. And so what you will see when you look at the heart and dissect down the road, we'll go this again. The vessel that's closest to you, if you're looking at that now on the dissecting tray, is going to be the one coming from the right ventricle. The one that's actually behind you, closer to the bottom of the tray, so it's going to be more. This is happening over time. It's like muscles folding. There's a massive chamber inside, lots of little nooks and crannies, yet they still have this amount of volume. It's not a lot, only about 4 ounces. Maximum, but it's not a lot. 4 ounces. They have a cut. It works. Okay. Now, here's my idea. So, right side, we go back to the lungs, we go back to the left side, to the body, right. So let's see, we got inputs. We have 3. I don't think there's 2. The inputs that are very, very famous that come into the right atrium. It looks like, well, here they're really only showing you one, but there's another one coming in. That's the superior vena cava. Cava means cavernous superior cell. It's not for vena, it's for veins. A cavernous sized name. So let me abbreviate that typically SVC. What's coming in, and it's a bit lower than it's doing it for illustrative purposes. It's the widest of all the veins. It would be the widest vessel in your body. The inferior vena cava. It's probably expanded, maybe within a significant thumb. Give you an idea. The aorta might be about as big. So they're smaller than you would think, certainly. Don't quite get that sense. It's smaller than you understand. That's the cavernous nature of veins. Veins are very. We didn't know it when we do this. At any one time, about 2/3 of your blood is through veins. So comparatively, the only a third, maybe a little less than that, is actually an artery. So we're all profoundly concerned about arteries. There's a lot more venous blood, and venous blood plays a much more important role, I think, other than blocking the blood not getting there. A lot of other causes of blood not being returned. More on that now. So you have 2 feeders, but yet there's another one I'll show you. In the back wall of the right atrium, there's a little opening, and that little opening is fed by something called coronary sinus. You'll see that on the back of the heart. Coronary sinus, we'll talk about sinuses in blood vessels. They're wide, flat veins that are collection points for certain veins. The coronary sinus is where the blood that comes from the coronary arteries eventually is collected by what are called the cardiac veins, and that blood is returned directly to the right atria to be used again. The heart So there's three inputs. Superior vena cava is head, neck, upper extremities. Inferior vena cava, torso and lower extremities. Blood flow from the coronary sinus is strictly coming back from the heart, blood that the heart used to feed its own muscular activity and now is being returned to be reoxygenated again. So that's sort of the starting point for all of this. So this is kind of the way it looks, more or less. Again, not as large as you think. Very, very occupied compartment, the pericardial cavity. There's a lot to it as we move on. You did this probably in AP1. It's very famous. It's this double layered sac kind of a thing. You have pericardium is very, very tough and thick. When I try to order the hearts for us, if depending on our budget, that have the pericardium on layers, you can see how tough it is. You have the outer layer is fibrous and tough. Okay, that is what they call the superficial fibers. Underneath it is the serous layer, and all things pericardium, pleura, and peritoneum. All those linings have a double layer. You have one that's inherently on the organ, that's called visceral, whatever it is, in this case pericardium or visceral pleura or visceral peritoneum. And on the wall of a chamber, whether it's a giant chamber like the abdomen or a relatively small chamber like the pericardial cavity, it's called parietal. That means it's on the wall. In this case, these structures the linings are relatively delicate, simple squamous type epithelia. They secrete a tiny bit of fluid that, if nothing else, is a very minor lubricating fluid. Okay, and that's pericardial fluid. And so there's not a whole lot to it. They always show you this, like if you had a balloon and you put your fist into it, how as you put your fist in, it'll adhere to your, let's say, to your hand or to your clenched fist. That would represent the visceral pericardium, and then the air that was left would certainly not approximate, but would represent, let's say, what the fluid was, and the outer layer of the balloon. They always show you. So it's a good look. Here's the fibrous one. Here's the interior of the heart. Here's the interior lining called endothelium. Simple squamous lining cells, epithelial cells that are continuous, those in the blood vessels. That's a hallmark of cardiovascular. The lining of the heart and the lining of the blood vessels, the lining over the valves are all the same. Simple squamous, and it's all referred to as endo, inside thelia lining. The middle layer is nearly all muscle, not all, but nearly all muscle tissue, known as myocardium. There are some structural elements, and there's some tissue that's similar to the muscle but doesn't contract. That's when we're going to get to the conducting system. That's the whole basis of those defibrillators we have sitting outside. That's a big deal that you should be familiar with. And the fiber stuff is out here. So the lining that you're going to get, you have endothelium. This is the epicardium. So the outside and the inside are very similar. It's just with muscle sort of sandwiched in between here. The lining here is the parietal pericardium, and it's not nearly as wide as this. They're drawing that just so you can see what it is. And it becomes inflamed with infection, with certain medical conditions. You can hear it with, again, I don't have the ear for it. Fluid can get in there from, let's say, in the days before we had airbags that would deploy, people would get whacked by steering wheels or any type of traumatic event along that in a big traumatic accident. You could easily get fluid. It's called tamponade. Anytime you have fluid someplace, the fancy term is tamponade. And the word tampon sort of came as part of that. Excessive fluid can compress the heart's ability to pump, and you do have to remove it. And again, it's not something people do. There's a lot of procedures that almost anyone can do. This would not be one of them. It would be like doing a spinal tap. It's not something that any amateur would try, because you're more likely to hurt somebody than help somebody. This would be the same. I've never done it. So I mean, it's remarkable the skill set that's involved for these things. Okay. So I skipped through that, and I'll get to that one. So the epicardium, the myocardium, you just saw, and I'll go back to that illustration shortly, which is the next one, the spiral bundles. That picture tells a tremendous story about the heart. And so what it surrounds, that myocardium, is on a skeleton. All it really is connective tissue that is the structure that holds those muscles, holds the valves, holds the big blood vessels, holds the heart in its place, and limits the spread of action potentials so we can get that sequential activity that's reflected when we look at an electrocardiogram. That's the picture. So it's this way. It's again, it's elegant design. It's a two-stroke pump. The first part of the pump that goes off is up here, the atrium. These are muscle fibers, and their whole job is to top off the ventricles. You're sitting here, your heart is filling at rest, about 80% of the way. When your heart gets ready to beat, the very last step, long before you sense the first heartbeat, the first bit of electrical activity starts these atrial muscles to contract and effectively do what they tell you not to do at the gas station. Don't top off the tank. They do. The whole idea is maximally fill heart. Whole ballgame. Every time your heart pumps, it's got to pump the same. It's got to pump the same amount out on both sides. It doesn't pump all 120 milliliters. It goes to about 96. The last 24 just come in such a way, and that's part of it. We'll get to the cardiac side. I think that's really cool. After that, the next signal isn't here in the middle. The signal goes very quickly all the way down to the apex, tip of the heart. And what it does with that spiraling activity of the muscles, not only does the signal come from the bottom up, which is blood out of the hand, but it does it in such a way that it's twisting and squeezing simultaneously. You've done it. I can tell. You know, you can, oh, don't. We go to the beach, and the towel gets wet. You just kind of fold it and squeeze it. No, right? You said on old Washington, we had a greater Dr. Man stuff. I know that was the thing to the guy from South Africa. I was brought up 20 miles from New York City. Believe me, we had washing machines. But my dad had one for his business with a ringer. Sid, I'm still remembering. So, all that stuff. Same illustration you saw before. Atria and ventricles, a divider. First noteworthy bit of anatomy. That's elegant. So these are, you know, I should have done this earlier, but I didn't find time. Anyway. These dividers are called septa. Septa between the atria, septa ventricle, septa between the atria and ventricle. In those septa, those natural dividers were the coronary arteries. Not all of them. The first one is referring to the atria, there. The babies, where they are born, developing in utero, the mom's breathing for baby. The umbilical circulation correctly. So effectively there's a shunt. So the blood is shunted from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart on the your oxygen. On birth, the baby's going to inflate, it takes over, okay? And that whole system begins to deteriorate. So what there is when you're born, before you're born, there's a little opening. There's that is called, that's the same name as the structure of the brain. And the bone, cerebral, is called the brain ovale, which is oval shaped open. And at birth, magically it closes, becomes just, you see still a little bit of indentation. So it becomes a fossa ovalis. That's the name it's in adults. Some individuals, that opening has a tiny pinpoint opening. It's a birth defect that some people never even notice. Okay? So it's a persistent foramen ovale rather than a complete formation of the fossa ovalis. The trouble is sometimes blood under pressure will squirt through that little hole, and anytime you get blood squirting out under pressure, it makes turbulence. Turbulence in blood is bad. It makes clots. That's what happened on not one but two occasions to the very famous hockey player here in Pittsburgh, Chris Letang, who my wife thinks is a handsome man. She always wants to see how he's doing. Her oldest is 42, so I don't know why she's so interested in that. Go figure. I told her more than once she should never marry some old guy. I'm 7 years older. Just saying. So the fossa ovalis is the remnant of that, but it can be a defect. So we're going to look at these septa or dividers. They're on the heart. You might dissect. You'll see what appears to be a blood vessel. It's usually the vein. Veins are typically on the surface. Arteries are beneath them, and the arteries are basically emptied out. So they're much finding what are called the coronary arteries difficult to do. You will see this illustration on multiple occasions. Okay, this is because it's got everything. It's got the valves, it's got the chambers, it's got the dividers, it's got the inferior structure, all of the above. So it's a really important one. So we'll stay away from that for just a second. I'll explain to you. Got two entries. Got two entry points. Notice on veins coming back to the heart, when they get this large, they don't have any valves to alter their flow. And the blood starts in the right atrium, and it's all about one-way traffic. It's got to be a flow pattern, and then to ensure that the heart has chambers that have valves. That's the first valve. It's between the atria and the ventricle. Okay? So you can call it the right atrioventricular valve. We don't. Okay? We describe the valves based on the appearance and number of the cusps, flaps. Now I'm drawing them this way. They're like boom and like boom. They're not like that. Valves are really sort of cup-like structures. This, and what happens when the blood is pushed back upon those valves, causes those cups to sort of come together like that. So the valves actually are cups that the blood pushes back, they kind of doors come against each other. The teeth, you'll find out that's the first portion. Is simultaneously the valves here and the valves here. I'll draw them linearly, but on this side, that valve has three, so we call it the tricuspid, three cups. Yeah. And it was named after, it resembles to anatomist top of like tricuspid tooth. And from there, the valves, from there the blood accumulates and collects and fills the right ventricle, and the blood leaves there. And again, to govern the flow appropriately, there's another valve. This valve also has three cups. It's called, that particular structure is pulmonary. We call it the pulmonary trunk. And eventually it splits relatively rapidly into two arteries. trunks, there's trunk, you're going to get at least more than one or two branches. That's the pulmonary trunk or pulmonary artery. It also works for the, and the name of that is, some people call it the pulmonic valve. It's good. I call it, and most people call it pulmonary, because it's got three cusps. They look like moon shaped, like half a crescent moon shape. They're called pulmonary semi-lunar valves. Now remember, the blood that's in this is deoxygenated blood, venous blood. Yet we call it the pulmonary artery. That's one of those counterintuitive points. Everybody thinks arteries have oxygenated blood. No, artery is about where the blood's coming from. An artery is taking blood away from the heart. The kind of blood is not part of the equation. The only artery in the adult with venous blood is the pulmonary artery. And because the baby circulation, the fetal circulation relies on umbilical circulation, returning it to the mom and then sending it back to the baby. The umbilical artery also happens to have venous blood, but our sort of model for this is going to be the adult. We're not looking at embryological development. So that's an important point. What artery in the adult has blood? Hey, pulmonary artery, there's only one answer. Here are the valves. Now the blood makes its way to the lung, gets oxygenated, it's coming back. Here it comes. It comes back by way of veins. Pulmonary veins. Veins are more numerous. Not only is there more blood, typically for every named artery, there is at least not one, but two named veins. Take your pulse at the radial artery here. There's typically two radial veins, at least. It could be more. Fancy term we give to it in Latin is called vena comitantes. So they're like the companion veins that go along with a particular named artery. So because there's effectively a pulmonary trunk makes two pulmonary arteries, one for each lung. Pardon me. You have typically four pulmonary veins. Just like the pulmonary artery, they're the oddball. Because by this time, blood coming into the pulmonary is arterial, oxygenated. These are red traceable markers. So the only vein in the adult with oxygenated arterial blood are the pulmonary. Blood then makes its way there, one way in. You have another valve. This is the odd valve, very famous. Probably the valve that most of the problems occur. It only has two flaps. All the others have three. It has two flaps, so originally and frequently it's referred to as the bicuspid valve, it's also called the mitral valve. It looks like a mitre. You know what the derivation of that is? What is a mitre? That's one example to give you in a chess piece is the bishop's hat. The bishop's hat has sort of that the bishop comes down. You won't look at you knew what a mitre was? No, see, good. But it kind of actually the bishop wears the cap that kind of comes up this way, like this, and there's like straps to go around the back. Part of the badge of office of the bishop, or two, a staff and a mitre. Helps the bishop will go. So it doesn't happen. I thought that would be, you'd be interested in that. You can't see it here. That's what anatomists looked at, that kind of a thing. So you have that arrangement. So typically it's talked about in that sort of way we refer to it as the mitral valve, and there's more mitral valve disorders. Valvular disorders have to do this. Normally, it should open easily, blood should be able to flow in. When it closes, it goes secure. Sometimes the valves are too stiff. They don't open or close, there's a little opening. They don't allow enough in, they're too taut, they don't close well. And so if they're too narrow, you'll hear the term, anytime something's too narrow, we talk about stenosis. The valves are secured, as you can see, the pressure pushes back on those valves. The pressure pushes back on those valves. You can see the cup-like design. You don't see it here. Valves in the ventricles, and you'll see this on the dissection, are held taut. And what it does is it prevents them from doing this. So the valves normally look like this. The worst thing that can happen, there's so much pressure that the valves kind of went out backwards. Like your umbrella that broke on the worst possible day, you can't quit. That's what the prolapse. Prolapse. To prevent prolapsing, there are string-like structures you can see over there called chorda tendinae. It's a little bit harsher. It means tendinous cord. It's a little outpouching cardiac muscle. The other goes this cardiac muscle has a fancy name called capillary. Capillary muscles. The interior has all these nooks and crannies. So collectively we call them trabeculi and bones. Trabeculi cardiac. Trabecular pattern is sort of a you see, and you'll see this better on an illustration, better on a heart that you can dissect, and better in another illustration, these little ridges. That's a recurrent thing that we see in a lot of biology. To expand, when structures are unexpanded, they kind of crinkle up. They sort of fan fold on. And when you fill them, they expand. So when the atria are empty, you see these little ridges, they look like little fingers, anatomists go up, so they call them pectinators. You see them in the atria, and the atria have expansion chambers with them called coracles. They look like this. All that you will see. So, now you can see some of the structures. So effectively what happens with blood flow, it comes in through the superior and inferior vena cava, a little opening back in there for the coronary sinus, goes down here. These valves are open at rest, these ones are closed. So it's continuously filled, like I said, about 80% when the heart starts its next cycle. And for the heart to exercise a complete cycle beat, it only takes about a quarter of a second. Whatever is left in the atria are topped off in the ventricles to fill it, so you can get what's called maximum efficiency. It's a term that you'll become familiar with called stroke volume. And what ensures that as the pressure builds up, that those valves function and don't prolapse, the chorda tendineae and the papillary muscles. And what prevents it from being ejected prematurely? The atrioventricular valve, the semilunar valves here on the pulmonary artery, and the ones that are here that I didn't write down on the aortic side, called the aortic semilunar valves, keep it in check. So that's really sort of the, I guess, a listing of how kind of what's going on with the heart. Okay. So a couple of little interesting things that you'll see. They talk about, again, these sulci, these indentations, the dividers. There's a natural divide here that you'll see when you do the dissection in a couple of weeks, called the coronary sulcus. And so again, major blood vessels are in there. And we'll go over which blood vessels we're going to do. And then you have one in the interventricular, which is a relatively large sulcus, particularly anteriorly and somewhat posterior. So they're showing it to you here. This is showing you the same. These are what the auricles look like. It's very distinctive, different color, different texture tissue. They're nothing more than expansion chambers. All they are. So they allow a more elaborate amount of filling to go on. This is the start of the aorta, where right after that aortic semilunar valve, the very first set of arteries the heart gives off are to itself. They are the very famous coronary arteries. There's one on the right, this way, and there's one on the left. So this is the continuation of the left one, and it divides into what's called the left anterior interventricular artery. When I learned about it, it was called the left anterior descending. They changed it, and it's a little clearer when you say when you say anterior interventricular. And one that goes all the way around the back called the circumflex. Whenever you see circumflexus going around back. Those are the two main branches you'll need to know of the left. This is the right coronary artery. It gives off a marginal branch going along this side, and then it also continues around the back and helps to form the mate to this called the posterior interventricular artery. This is the widowmaker, classically. Because a heart attack here basically clobbers your left ventricle, and that's really what makes your blood circulate. It keeps your organs alive and going. So all of those are part and parcel. It's simple, but it's so complex in all of the things that it does and how it maintains itself in balance. It's a lot of what can go wrong. And even at all of your young ages, you need to be cognizant of that. Is there heart disease in your family? Eventually, as you start to get along, you start thinking about, I really have, it's like when I go to the gym, the first thing I do is cardio. My arms are I'm never going to have those kind of arms, despite what you think. Okay. So I get on a treadmill for 45 minutes and get my heart rate to where it's supposed to be. Plugged in. My wife always goes to a machine far away from me. Do you know him? No, never saw him before. We walked in together. Just a coincidence. Back of the heart. That's the coronary sinus. Those normally blood vessels are named. So you have radial artery, radial veins, femoral artery, femoral veins. The big different ones, you have coronary arteries and cardiac veins. And the cardiac veins all come together in a central confluence. Okay, it's like tributaries, Monongahela, Allegheny, Point, White, Ohio, confluence. Same deal with the heart. All the cardiac veins lead to what's called the coronary sinus, and then that opens into the right atrium, which would be over here. So here's the interventricular artery, the continuation of that, continuing to the right coronary artery, the posterior interventricular artery, etc. So you can see those structures that are there. Pulmonary veins, the illustration gives it to me a little bit better. Atria are thin, not a lot of muscularity, very little with propulsion. The auricles increase volume when needed. The ridges, mostly posterior pectinate muscles. The three vessels supply it, superior, inferior, and coronary sinus. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from lungs. Again, pectinate muscles, the pulmonary veins. Same illustration again. The right ventricle, when you go back and look at the illustrations, the right ventricle appears the largest when you look at the heart from the front. Based on mass, it would be the left ventricle, but based on surface area, it would be the right ventricle. the way to express it. The trabeculae carneae, there's ridges all throughout that give it effectively volume. Looks like a small space, it's a big space. The papillary muscles project in and anchor the cortex. The ventricles, the left ventricle is 3 to 4 times as thick with myocardium. The muscle is that much thicker. So it looks, comparatively speaking, smaller. It's not. It's just that the muscle sort of overwhelms your view when you look at it relatively quickly. And so you'll see, you can see this mass. So that's right ventricular muscle. It still pumps. This ejects very famously around 120 pressure of millimeters of mercury, like 120/80 being the so-called normal. This ejects blood going to your lung about 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury. So it's a big distinction. It's there. This has got to travel all the way around the body. This just makes the lungs better. Pardon. My voice is going. Not a lot I can tell you with these illustrations. I don't love them. Unidirectional flow of the valves. No valves are found between major veins and atria because of the inertia of the blood. When we get to valves, they're basically in veins in the extremities and in those areas of the heart that you saw. Here's that look. The pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, bicuspid, mitral versus tricuspid. And again, you can see those chordae tendineae fairly well from that. And then this is just a series of ways of looking at it. Blood flowing in, all the directions, filling up here. And then you can see that's what I mean by the cup-like structure. Now those valves, when pressure ramps up as your heart gets ready to beat at the ventricle level, the pressure is enough to close those valves between the atria and the ventricles, both right and left simultaneously. That's the very famous first heart sound of lub-dub fame, the loudest. The second one has to do when your heart finally starts to relax, and has a lot to do with the elasticity of the arteries. And we'll get there. And that's what these are going to. And here's the incompetency of the valves. Blood backflows to the heart, repumps it. So if it's too narrow, if it's too weak, if it doesn't close properly, all of these create problems with efficiently pumping. And yeah, you can do valve replacement. These days, they tend to remodel valves rather than replace them. If you have to replace a valve, typically that person has to be on blood thinners for the rest of their life. And that has its own stuff, even though they're making better blood thinners. So a lot of times they do what's called a valvuloplasty as a first choice. There's lots of things that create murmurs for years. It had to do with rheumatic fever, which was from strep throat, particularly in the days before we had antibiotics. That was common. So you'll run into people who I have to take antibiotics before I go to the dentist. I have to take antibiotics before I even have minor procedures done because you're worried about their valves are irregular and it's very easy if there's a transient bacteremia. So you go and get your teeth scaled and cleaned a couple of times. You have a transient bacteremia. You have a dental procedure, certainly. And it just follows it. So it's about equality, 3 or more times thicker. You could do this cutaway in the lab and actually see that relate. Even though this looks bigger, it's not. It's just sort of distorted by the mass of muscle that's there. You can stretch it out so they're equal volumes. Coronary circulation, the shortest. When your heart's actively pumping, the coronary circulation is between beats because the muscles contract and close those vessels. So they both arise from the base of the aorta. They both encircle the heart and the coronary sulcus. They do that. It's a wonderful word, anastomose. And anastomosis literally means another mouth. When we sew together, if someone has has a tumor in their gut. You take out a piece of gut that has the tumor, and you take the ends, because there's plenty of it, and you sew it back together. That's called creating an anastomosis. When you do coronary artery bypass surgery, you put in new arteries. Basically, they're veins that become arteries. We call those doing an anastomosis. But they naturally occur, and these are alternative pathways. Your blood, if one is not completely open, there's lots of other ways for blood to get there. It's sort of like what they don't do with the roads here. When there's a detour, you're not stuck forever. There's ways to get around it. So additional routes for delivery, no, they can't compensate for a true blockage. And the heart consistently receives at least this much blood. There's the names I gave you: anterior interventricular, circumflex on the left, right marginal, and posterior interventricular from the right. In general, left coronary artery supplies a great deal of the left side and much of the anterior part of the heart. The right, more so the right ventricle, and more of the posterior side of the heart. And these are the anastomoses. There's also there in veins as well. So the coronary signs, the veins, again, they're cardiac veins. You see anastomoses there as well. Names are not that critical. And that same illustration. Chest pain. Angina pectoris. It does not mean that it means cells are weakened. It means they don't get enough oxygen. It does not mean there's a blockage. It means that for whatever reason, blood's not getting through. It could be a blockage. It could be a fault with the heart itself. It could be a fault with blood pressure, something else occurring in some other process in the blood, toxins. Okay. Most of the time, it's circulatory based, and most of the time, I would agree, it's probably because there's some degree of blockage. Same thing with a heart attack. Myocardial, what's an infarction? Death of tissue from lack of blood supply, period. Infections are microbiological phenomena. Infarctions are circulatory phenomena. When someone has a stroke, they have part of the brain infarcting, dying of that. The kidneys can become infarcted. There's any tissue can die from lack of blood supply. Myocardial means it's a heart attack. Most of the time, it's accompanied by significant pain. Sometimes you can have the pain and not have a heart attack. Sometimes you can have the heart attack and not have pain. It just depends. So it can be an absolute blockage or just relatively speaking. You see it every winter. Somebody goes out, has been sitting around, first snow, they go out there, some older person has done a lot of activity, I got to get my car out, and they keel over, unfortunately. They get a heart attack or they die because it's relative. Vigorous physical activity with insufficient power to supply it with blood. And it becomes scar tissue. If it affects a significant area, some people don't survive. I think we'll leave it there. All right. That's what I wanted to do. We'll get more into that. I'll bring in the technology, I think, next time, so we can look at the EKGs. I will have more information on when we dissect, probably after it. And we should be all set. Thank you. That. Even I'm tired of listening.